صلى الله على سيدنا محمد أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحابته ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Inshallah, I'll just finish these principles that we were going over yesterday. After the 5 dominant principles, Izz ibn Abd as-Salam, who's one of the great scholars of usul, said that he's reduced all of the principles of usul to 2 principles in Sharia: the accruement of benefits and avoidance of harms. So everything in Sharia is either to accrue benefits or to avoid harm for the human. And then some added to that in fact really only one is considered, which is benefit, because even avoidance of harm is a benefit. Now, in terms of ease and facilitation, there are basically 7 reasons for it. One is traveling. So when a Muslim travels, because of the nature of traveling, there's a hardship in it. That there's ease made, facilitation made. For instance, in the prayer, we're able to shorten the prayer. And shortening the prayer, although it's a rukhsa, it's considered a sunnah. Unlike, for instance, breaking your fast. Breaking your fast is permissible, but it's not a sunnah when you travel. So you can do it, but shortening the prayer is actually a sunnah when you travel. So it's encouraged, even if you don't have any hardship, to shorten the prayer anyway. And then illness is another reason for ease, marad. If somebody becomes ill, then rules change for them, because they obviously can't fulfill the same functions that a person who is healthy can. And then the third is coercion, ikrah. A person who is being coerced into things can even to the point where they can deny their Islam, if that's going to benefit them. So if somebody was threatening to say that they would kill them if they were Muslim, then they could say at that point that they're not Muslim, as long as the Quran says their heart is content with Iman. And then another is forgetfulness, that one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ said, that the pen of responsibility has been raised from 3 in my ummah, from the child until they reach puberty, the sleeper until they wake, and the mad person until they become well. And then in another hadith he said that Allah does not take my ummah to account for their unintentional mistakes, their forgetfulness, or what they were forced or compelled to do by others without choice. And then also ignorance of a judgment, jahal bil hukm. So in certain situations that there's a reason, that's a valid reason. If somebody really doesn't know, and it's not something that there was necessarily, if it was a fard ayn, there's things that there's no excuse for not knowing. And there are other things that there's an excuse for knowing, not knowing. And then overwhelming difficulty is usr. And this is something in which it becomes so difficult that it's really hard to function, and that necessitates facilitation. So an example of that would be like a butcher. Even though blood is najis in normal circumstances, for a butcher, they can pray with in an area where there's blood, and they could pray even with blood on them, because it would be just too difficult for that person. It's his job, and if he's working in the daytime, that's one example. Another example is a woman taking care of small children. Even though she needs to be vigilant about the uncleanliness of urine and these things, because it's so difficult for her to do that she's excused. If she prays and there's najasa on her clothes, then that's overlooked. And that's an example of usr, facilitating ease. And another is when things spread to such a degree that the whole community is affected by it. For instance, now paper money, right? Usurious money. That's That's how the world is doing their transactions. So for you to completely disengage from that would create an undue hardship on you, a type of usr on you, so that at that point then there's ease facilitated for you. And then another is, the seventh is deficiency, which is called naqs. And this is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lets us know that there are situations where there's deficiency, and that's a valid reason for excuses. For children, for instance, why there's no taklif for children. The lame, right? If somebody is physically incapable, they don't have the responsibility of jihad, of doing things, defending the city if they can't. Somebody who's blind. These are deficiencies that are recognized by Sharia, and there's absolutely no blemish or fault on the person who is deficient. And also women concerning livelihood, that women are not, because of the nature of children, the bearing of children, raising of children, Allah has excused women from the hardship of livelihood, of earning a living, and put that responsibility on men for that reason. And also Jumu'ah. The woman does not have to go to Jumu'ah because it would be an undue hardship on her because of the nature of her responsibilities with her children and other things. Yes.
Would that then fit under overwhelming instead of deficiency?
Well, it goes under naqs. In other words, because the naqs is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that there's some aspects of the group or of the individual, or in this case of the gender, that does not enable them to fully participate in something. So there's a type of naqs there, and that's how it's defined. But it is related to difficulty, to an overwhelming burden. I mean, that is part of it. But it's actually related to the fact that pregnancy is seen, in Sharia, for instance, as actually like an illness. And late-term pregnancy is considered an actual possible terminal illness, right? I mean, it's literally seen as an illness in which the person could very well die from. Now, that's been lessened certainly in this culture where you have technological means for that, but still, it's a very serious problem around the world. For women when they're pregnant, they're in a condition that could easily become dangerous for her. I mean, it is a dangerous condition, but it could easily become tragic or...
So, what is it about when dealing with these things? Because like if a blind person were sitting here, they probably wouldn't consider themselves under that definition of being deficient, although they knew that they had...
That's a very modern thing. You see this idea, of saying, that they're visually impaired or visually challenged, or... I mean, this is a very modern idea, and I know that a lot of us have been kind of indoctrinated in schools and things about this, but it's really denying some very obvious facts about reality. The Sharia is very clear that there is a naqs there. I mean that blindness is it does limit people. It does, whether we like it or not. It limits people, and what the Sharia is saying is this in no way reflects on their spiritual state or on who they are as a human being, but it does have an impact on certain things that they're not able to do, that other people are able to do. Absolutely, yes. That the Sharia definitely sees that. Now, this does not mean that, this is not a blanket statement for all women. There are women that are, more capable than most men in all the various areas that men do things in. It's not saying that this is every single woman, no, but it's saying because the majority of women will get pregnant, the majority of women will experience raising children, I mean, that the hukam goes for, yeah.
Maybe the problem is the word deficient. I mean, if it was, you know, that they have some limitations, or I mean, I don't know, just the word deficient is very...
Naqasa means, in Arabic, naqasa means, it does relate to limitations, you know. And limitations are yeah, I mean, we'll get into semantics, but it's in no way saying, like, from a Sharia point of view, a woman is spiritually the same as a man. There's literally no different at the spiritual level, and it's very clear in the Quran that, and in terms of her rights, in some ways the Sharia is actually, there is, well, Allah says, لَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ. They have the same rights that are against them. بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. And then it says, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً. And men have 1 degree over the women. That's in the Quran. The Mufassirun interpreted that generally to mean that the degree of that men have over women is that they should fulfill all of their rights to women, but should not expect women to fulfill all their rights to men. That's how Ibn Abbas interpreted it. In other words, that a man should be expected to give all of his rights owing to the woman in any relationship, but he should be willing to overlook any of the rights that she does not fulfill. So,
there was a hadith about the Prophet saying the women, not the women, the majority of people in hell will be women. Is that true?
There is a hadith that says that, and it's called ahad hadith, and which is a hadith of singular narrations. It's not a mutawatir hadith. And the thing about hadiths with singular narrations is that they cannot be used for a point of aqidah. And in other words, they cannot be used to give us a judgment or a fixed principle about the aqidah. And the next world is called the ghaybiyat or sam'iyat, is related to aqidah. So really the hadith cannot be used to, as a way of proving something about the aqidah. Generally, what I've seen is it's been used as the reason that was given was called kufran al-mu'ashara, which is that it was a warning, the hadith was a warning to women not to show ingratitude about mu'ashara, which is marital relationships, that they should be reminded to show gratitude and be grateful.
I don't remember the age wording of the but there's a part that because women can't pray during
That's another hadith. That's not the same hadith. That is another hadith that relates to naqs. And it's the word that's used, and this is why the usuli people use that word and it said that the women have naqs in their deen, and that they have naqs in their reasoning. That's what the hadith says. And again, the ulama have been very clear to point out that the naqs that was mentioned is not a blanket statement. That you're talking about the majority of women, and certainly not all women, because there are many women whose deen is by far much, much better than the vast majority of men, and there are many women whose intellects by far surpass the intellects of most men.
Would that fall under your deficiency? I mean,
it's the word that's used is naqs, and I'm translating it here. Now, in Arabic, nanqus means to nanqus al-ard min atrafiha. It's used in the Quran that we remove from the edges of the earth, right? Or begin, and some say it's what's happening on the shores, like a breakdown of the shore. So it has to do with a lessening or something like that. And I know there's a word that, Jamal Badawi is so diplomatic, and there's a really good word that he uses, and I can't remember what it is. And I remember him coming up to me and saying, don't use that word deficient. What's that?
Under deficiency is extreme poverty.
Extreme poverty would be naqs. Yeah, in a society, a person who is extremely poor is definitely naqas. So it just relates to the inability to fulfill functions that other people.
So does the Hadith mean that because she has these limitations or these extreme poverty?
Yeah, it's the limitation in prayer is the menstrual cycle, right? That women will not pray a large. I mean, if you actually work it out over their lifetime, it will be a large portion of time that a man would pray, especially if a woman has an average cycle of maybe 5 to 7 days in the month. I mean, that's a considerable amount of time. And although in the Maliki school she can recite the Quran even from the Mus'haf, but generally she will be limited. She won't fast during that time, and her worship is cut off. And then the other is related to the situation, the cycle and the effects that it has on women as well. Because these are, they're real effects. Not all women have the same response, but there are many women that do. The hormonal changes that take place during that time can be very difficult and trying for women. Right.
Is naqs a word that is used in the Quran anywhere?
Yes, it is used in the Quran several times.
And it's in regard
Huh?
to the same.
What's that?
It's in regard to the same stuff.
No, not this. Not about this. Not about what we're talking.
Basically Sharia right here.
This is Sharia.
And then in terms of naqs, is it mentioned in terms of women?
Sorry, you looking in Handswear? What are you saying there?
Oh, I don't know. Okay. It says decrease, diminution, deficit, loss, damage, wantage, lack, want, shortage, gap, blank, omission, defect, shortcoming.
It's usually like a lack or a want. That would be a good. Now, the thing about it is that again, this relates to cosmology, right? It really does. It relates to cosmology and it relates to some fundamental differences in terms of opposites and the male and the female. There's opposites there, right? And even within, what's taking place in the Allah says about, وَمَنْ يُنَشَّأْ فِي الْحِلْيَةِ وَهُوَ فِي الْخِصَامِ غَيْرُ مُبِينٍ. About being raised in, and I think there's some socialization that's involved here, definitely. The idea of women being raised with ornaments is mentioned in the Quran. That in most human societies, women are raised with ornaments. The idea that that a woman, if she ornaments herself, that it's an addition, right? It's an addition, whereas a man is not ornamenting himself. See, a woman who's ornamenting herself in a culture, if she puts on earrings, if she puts on a makeup, if she's doing these things, then there's an addition there. Whereas the man is not doing that. So there, an addition of ornament, a zina. No, the Quran doesn't say it's bad, but it points it out, because what the Quraysh were doing is that they were saying that many of the idols they were worshipping were female by nature. Lat, Uzza, Manat. They were female idols. And Allah said to them that, why is it that you take as gods that which you yourselves ornament? Yunasha'u fil hilya. Right? And the idea that what the Quran was articulating there is that what you're saying in your ornamentation of the women is that there's a want there. And that negates divinity, that there's no want. That, a God, an ilah, has no needs. And the idea that if you ornament something, that there's a need, there's a lack there.
So it's not something that's imposed by socialization, or is it a state that our fitna is of nas?
I think there's the ayah, the way that it's articulated is one, that it's used in the passive form, yunasha'u, which would indicate that there's definitely some socialization going on, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there's definitely some socialization going on. But also, from the Sharia point of view, given the nature of pregnancy, the nature of childbirth, the nature of the need for raising children and these things, that this limits the activities of a woman. And if she's not fulfilling these functions, that there's actually harm to the society itself. I mean, in this culture, I personally, although this culture has, in the idea that men can raise children and these things, I think that there are men that probably could develop within their character, nurturing qualities and characteristics, but they certainly, given the vast majority of men that I know and I've known in my life, if I can make a sampling, I don't think they have anywhere near the nurturing qualities that women do by their nature, which does not mean there's a lot of women that don't have those qualities and certainly have lost those qualities. And if you move to other cultures, you will find that those qualities are still very much enhanced. And so, there's definitely, within the Islamic teaching, I think there's an honoring of those qualities, right, in the woman. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ said, حُبِّبَ إِلَيَّ مِن دُنْيَاكُمْ ثَلَاث. I was made to love from your world 3 things, and one of them was women, an-nisa. And that is not in any way a sexual love. Astaghfirullah, hasha. He loved the qualities of women. I mean, that is something the Prophet said, that he loved from the world the qualities of women. And he is called Rahmatan lil Alameen, a mercy to all the worlds. And Allah says, I took the word mercy from the word womb. So the source of mercy is the womb. And he's called a Nabi al-Ummi, the prophet from the mother. Right?
So what you're saying is actually that man has deficiency in other ways, basically.
Absolutely. But it's the men's deficiencies are much more batin, whereas the women's deficiencies are much more zahir. So this is where you get into cosmology. The interior of women is generally stronger than the interior of men. The exterior of men is stronger than the exterior of women, generally. Well, I'll give you an example. When I worked in hospitals, women endure pain much better than men. Just to give you one example. I used to always amaze me, you get these big, giant kind of tattoos all over the place. And, you need to do a needle stick. And these big men, whereas the old lady would just put her arm out and not, say anything. Qazwin, Rumi tells a story about the man from Qazwin. He goes to a tattoo artist and he says, right? He says, make me a lion. I want a lion right on my back because I've got Leo rising, right? And so he says, and just make it really a majestic lion. And so the tattoo artist puts the first pin in and, what's that? He said, it's the tail. He said, no, forget the tail. We don't need a tail. So then he starts again. He says, what's that? And he said, it's the rump. He said, no, forget the rump. We don't need a rump. And then he starts again. He says, what's that? He said, it's the stomach. He said, no, he can do without a stomach. And he goes on, and the man just can't take it. And so finally the tattoo artist just throws the needle down, and he says, look, even God didn't make a lion like this. All right? So, which is, the point Rumi was making is that there's people just have an idea about themselves, which is totally false. And I think a lot of men have an idea about themselves, which is totally false. So, from the Sharia in no way is setting up antagonistic opposites, right? It really isn't. The whole point of Sachiko Murata's book was to indicate that really the cosmology of Islam is more akin to the idea of yin and yang, that these are complementary opposites. They are not antagonistic opposites. In the West, there has been an antagonism set up between the male and the female. And this has resulted in literally the war of the sexes, in a lot of really serious problems. In the Islamic tradition, there's no doubt that women have been abused and oppressed in many, many cultures, and certainly Islam has not been exempt from that in any way. And we've seen it. My own experience in the Muslim world, I've seen these things. But the actual tradition itself, in fact, is, and the fact that there has been an oppression is an indication of something in itself, of the nature of weakness and strength outwardly. And there are many verses in which Allah warns the man, and the best example is the actual verse which is in Surah An-Nisa about if a man is disciplining a woman who's disobedient, and it says that if you don't see from her, if she's not doing anything which is incorrect, then don't desire to transgress the limits. And then it says, and know that Allah is exalted and great. And the Mufassirin say that what Allah is saying is that Allah, if He's given you some physical strength that can empower you and enable you to oppress a woman, you should know that there's one stronger than you who's able to destroy you. You see? It's very clear. So Allah warns the man. Allah says, don't leave a woman suspended, mu'allaqa. Don't, neither divorcing her nor living with her in a good way, ma'roof. Prophet ﷺ literally put the khayriyah related to people, how they treat women. He said, khayrukum li ahli. The best of you are the best to your women, and I'm the best of you to my women. So he literally put the khayriyah of the human condition in how, for the male, in how they treated their women. So there are many examples of that, but I think that generally, and this is definitely, I think particularly in our culture and the culture I was raised in, I was raised by, was raised by my mother, not my father, but I had, 4 sisters, grew up in an environment with a lot of women. And, I think definitely brought up with a sensitivity to that idea. But in this culture, I think what's happened is there have been some things that are very positive about bringing some awareness to things, but then there have also been things that have been very negative in creating a lot of antagonism and creating a lot of problems. So there are definitely some very positive things in that we've become aware of certain things that really I think have a lot of people have not been aware of. But then there are other qualities and aspects, which is taking something to an extreme. I think a book that's really worth reading is Brain Sex by I think her name's Wynne. Can't remember right now. And her PhD was in I think neurology or genetics. But she just clearly indicates that all of the research is indicating that there are very, very strong and major differences between the female nature and the male nature, that we are dealing really with some very fundamental differences. And that she said to attempt to say that, that there's this absolute equality is building a society on a biological lie. And the idea is not, when we say something's not equal, we assume automatically that there has to be disparities and things like this. That's the automatic assumption. Whereas I think from the Quranic worldview, it's not. That is not the assumption. The assumption is there are differences, and the differences are related to not just function, but also qualities. I think personally one of the reasons why the Quran does not in any way encourage the idea of a woman being involved in witnessing and in blood and these type of things is actually in sense a protection of something that is inherent to her nature, which is mercy. Because the nature of a witness is that they have to lose their compassion, they have to lose their mercy and become this kind of objective, non-biased, this is it, I don't care what happens to this person. You know, it's very interesting, which is easier for men. They've done these studies like at Stanford where they hooked men and women up to all these PET scans, and then they would tell really sad stories. And the women's brains would just become totally activated, right? All these centers would be activated from these stories, and the men's wouldn't. You know, it'd be just like, you know, so what? You know, somebody died. Really. It's very interesting. So the women, there's a compassion there and an empathy to people they had no knowledge about. They would, you know, just hearing their story would cause them to feel a type. Women, if they hear a baby cry, right, who's not their baby, will often start, the milk will start flowing, right? It's not their baby. The milk will literally start flowing. One of the things, like in Mauritanian culture, is that a little baby, if it goes into the tent of another woman who happens to have a baby, and it's hungry or crying, she immediately takes it and feeds it. And that's how a lot of the wet nursing, many of the children there are related. I know a man, he's told me he had over, I think, 40 mothers from wet nursing, because he grew up in a tribal situation where if he was hungry and a woman was there, I mean, she just took him and fed him, right? Now, those are qualities that you're just not going to find in the vast majority of men. I mean, you will find men that are deeply compassionate. The Prophet ﷺ, one of the things he was accused of was being like a woman. You know, he was the Arabs were just they were tough people. They didn't like shows of emotion. One of the I think Jadd ibn al-Qais, he saw the Prophet kissing a baby and he said, "You kiss babies?" He said, "I've got 10 children. I've never kissed one of them." And the Prophet said to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, "I have nothing in my teaching for people that don't have mercy in their hearts." Yeah. So, I think you really have to be careful and just. I think it's probably more difficult for. It's more difficult for when a woman hears these things like what I was just mentioning. It obviously has a very different impact than what a man does.
I think it's like a linguistic thing. Like when you see these words, there's something that comes to your mind. I think from my experiences, I hear stories from Muslim women that men in their lives have taken the words and actually used them against the woman, rather than taking them for what they are. Yeah. There's an inherent bias that comes when you hear a word like that.
Right.
And it's not so.
No, I think that's
for
really
a woman
good.
To hear the words is different than to actually have an experience from a man that comes from.
That confirms something. No, I think that's a really good point. I think it's a very good point. And this is definitely something. And part of this, there's an onus within the family itself, and certainly on the woman to break type of jahili cycles that take place within the family, right? Clear preferences to males, right? Because this is something, unfortunately, that the women have been socialized into, and is alien to the Islamic tradition. The Prophet ﷺ, his children, he had daughters. Fatima was the closest for all his children, and he's called Abu Zahra. I mean, I knew an Arab man who had a daughter, and I called him by the kunya of his daughter's name, and he's like really offended. Right? And I said, I find it really interesting that the Prophet ﷺ was, one of the names that he's honored with is being called the father of Fatima. So Abu Zahra. So I don't see why anybody should,
I just wanted to go on what you just said about things he said. I think the main problem is the amount of ignorance there is among Muslims because, and what you were saying about witnessing, I mean, those things really make sense to me. But the problem is that I think that there should be a responsibility for scholars when they're talking about these things to make sure, it's one thing just to think about, well, hurting a woman's feelings. But the other thing is to make sure that you're trying to clear up the misperceptions of the brothers in the audience.
Right.
The brothers also hear the word deficient, and, inshallah, I would hope that most of them, get a positive understanding of that.
Right.
But there are a lot of brothers who go back to their families and say, and treat their the women in their life as though they're deficient.
Right.
And forbid them from going to the mosque if they're deficient, or, just in all these various ways in which they reinforce this idea, which is not what the word means, but it's what they understand.
Right. No, I think those are all really well taken points.
Al-Ghazali, who was, is a greatly respected scholar and all that, say things like, because I think this kind of has something to do with it too, when our really highly respected scholars say things like, if you really want to be close to Allah, stay away from women, things like that. And then Rumi has this poem about women and the donkey and doing really horrible, horrendous things. And
Bad translation, by the way.
Oh. Well, that was really bad.
Yeah.
But I mean,
That was a really, that's, my friend Muhammad Isa Wiley, who's who's a Rumi scholar, when I asked him about some of the poems that I'd read in one translation, and that's one of them, he said, the Maulana would never, that's not his language. And then he just said that he called that translation Rumi, R-O-O-M-Y. So, again, you're getting into cosmology, and I think definitely there are definitely some very serious problems that can arise, and abuses of language and the cosmology that has been traditionally understood in the Islamic teaching. A good example of that is the idea of, within the Greek and particularly the Hellenistic Christian tradition, women were seen as evil. And I read once a story about an American man who went to a monastery, a Greek-Orthodox monastery, on one of the islands, and you have to go up on baskets to get up there. They're like up on top of cliffs, and you can't get there without being hoisted up in a basket. And he said that he was there with this monk, and they were looking out over the Aegean Sea, and he was feeling very spiritual, and he was wishing that this monk could communicate some truth to him, but he couldn't speak Greek. And he said at that point, the monk said to him in English, "Women evil." And he said it just was so kind of disturbing for him, right? And that was the idea, that a monk, in a sense, that was part of what he was fleeing from, right? And the Prophet ﷺ really nullified all of those ideas. Salama, he took counsel with. It's unheard of, right? On the day of, when they went to make the Hajj and then they were prohibited from making the Hajj, well, they made an agreement, and one of the agreements was that they would go back and not make Hajj. And Omar was furious. It was really the only time Omar really, he challenged, in a sense, the Prophet ﷺ. And that was the day that the only person that didn't was Abu Bakr from the men. And he shook Omar and just said, "Look, do you know who he is? He's a messenger of Allah. You think he's doing this from himself?" But the Prophet went in and he told Salama what was happening. And Salama said, you should go out and you should shave your head and you should sacrifice your hadi, which was the right. That's how they would have completed their hajj. Just do that as a way of making the people feel that it's not in total loss, that they've come and they came with the intention of doing hajj, and inshallah Allah will reward them with the hajj. And that's what he did. The Prophet took her advice and went out and did that. And there are many examples of that. You know, the Prophet ﷺ had great respect for his women, and certainly Aisha radiallahu anhu is somebody who her opinion was regarded at the highest levels by the companions.
I think that's my understanding of the Prophet ﷺ and his wives. People tend to look at it as only they, women then. Like there's no women now who have respect that come in or who that are deserving. Like only they, like no other women since then could possibly be, not possibly, that are not deserving of respect.
I think we're dealing with a lot of jahiliyyah within the Muslim communities and cultures. And I certainly know a lot of men that aren't like that, but I do know a lot of Muslim men that do hold these type of attitudes, and there needs to be a lot of education. There really does. And I think part of the shock now is that there are many, many Muslim women, for instance, in this culture, that don't want to marry from their traditional cultures anymore. They really don't. There's Muslim women that have been raised here from other cultures that don't want part of that. Because they see it in a different light. They do see certain things that are, they're not right. They're not right. To give you an example, Sidi Abdullah al-Qadi, he told me, one of the things he told me is that in his house, he never asks his wife for anything. He always gets what he wants. If he wants, tea or something, or if he goes and does it for himself, which is a sunnah in the house. He told me she's got 5 children. She doesn't need another, another helpless person in the house, right? And when they asked Aisha what the Prophet was in the house, she said, "Kana fi khidmati ahlihi." He was serving his family, the women. He was helping them out. He used to sew his own clothes. He didn't have his women sew. He used to sew his own clothes. He repair his own things. And that's what he did. And now in a lot of cultures, that's like, it's aib. It's aib. For a man to do something, it's like, it's aib.
Are you saying that advice doesn't have any foundation when the scholars or the Sufis give the advice that if you want to be close to Allah, stay away from women and all that kind of thing? It sounds like
what I'm wondering, like when I read this Al-Ghazali Breaking the Desires, it talks in the introduction about his influence of all, like Plato and all these different like Western philosophers, and then it starts talking about women as the snares of the devil. And do you think that some of that like seeps in there, or is it?
I think what Imam al-Ghazali was talking about, he is talking about 2 fundamental desires within the human being. One of them is the stomach, and the other is the genitals. And he's saying that if we can master these, then we become masters of ourselves. If we can't master these, then we're slaves to ourselves. Now, for a man, those relate to, one of them relates to their desire for women. Zuyyina للناس حب الشهوات من النساء, and that's one of the things. Now, that ayah is equally as applicable to women as well in relation to men, right? I think that what is being said there can be equally applied for women in terms of men in relation to men. Although men definitely have a more difficult time, right, in these matters than women. And this is changing in the modern times, particularly in this country. But that is not something that has traditionally been the situation. Men are weaker in these matters. In fact, it very clearly says in the Quran, خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, that man was created weak in relation to women. That the women have a strength that men don't have. And the Prophet ﷺ said, for instance, that a woman's capacity for sexual enjoyment is actually greater than a male's. And in one by 99 parts. And he said, except Allah has made modesty so overbearing in a woman There's a modesty that Allah has placed in women that He didn't place in men, right? And this is why it's quite rare in cultures all over the world. You know, I mean, you don't find women traditionally doing a lot of the crude things that men will do, you know, in relation to these things. So it's certainly not talking about, it is talking about the idea that a man must learn to control that. And if he doesn't, then he is susceptible to losing himself. About what?
You said something about
What's that?
yeah,
زين what's that in Ali Imran? It's in Ali Imran. It means that, you know, for men, it has been made beautiful to a man, the lusty desire for women. That's something man is attracted to. But Allah is saying that that's something he needs to overcome. You know, but there's definitely, that is a very strong attraction within the male species, right? And this is part of the reason is that the hijab is, in a sense, really, the onus has been put on the woman out of the weakness of the man. For instance, a man, now look at this, a man can walk in the street with his shirt off. Now, it is not permissible for a woman to look at the man's chest if it's an ajnabi man. But the onus wasn't put on men because women are not seen. You know, Allah is saying that they're not as weak as men are in that area, that type of attraction. I mean, women, really, most women, certainly traditionally, and I think still to this day, are just, they're not just, you know, they're men that'll just go off. If they see a woman, they get seduced. There's a tradition about Dawood alayhi salam saw all of these worshippers, and he was admiring them. And Allah said, if I sent one woman to these men, they would just go off with her. You know, in other words, you think they're great or bad, but the reality of it is you know, they don't have an inner strength, right? So that is the type of weakness that the male has been given. I think males are more aware of it because this is our, you know, this is our experience, right? And it isn't the female experience; it's the male experience. Now there are female experiences that we're not aware of, right? I mean, this is the human condition. Now I had a teacher who was a male feminist. He was teacher that taught me epistemology, and one of the books we had to read was towards a feminist epistemology. And one of the things, his argument was that it's impossible for a man to understand the feminine condition. I mean, he just felt it's impossible. We can't do it. We're incapable of understanding it. And I disagreed with him in that I said that I think that the essential experiences for instance, there are many women that have experienced oppression, right? Now, although I cannot experience the female experience of oppression, I know what oppression is, and I know my reaction to it because I have been oppressed, and I think everybody in this room at some time in their life has felt oppression, and they've felt the experiences that go with it, right? So we do have bonds and connections. You know, we've felt pain, we've felt anguish, we felt love, we felt hate, we felt jealousy. These are shared human experiences. And these are things that can bind us and keep us together.
Feminists came to, you know, one of the sheikhs, and you know, he said it's very unfair that, you know, when you have the salah, you know, the men are in front and the women in front.
Right.
And the sheikh said, well, why don't you put the women in front and see how the men do? You know,
right, they'll lose their prayer.
You know, because they won't
That's true.
Wrong, you know,
That's true. I mean, the fact that women are behind the men, it's a clear indication there that is not a major distraction for a woman in the way it is for a man.
So most of the statements about, you know, when you say women are snares of evil and stuff,
it relates to an inherent flaw in the male. It's a fundamental weakness in the male, right? It really is. It's not about the woman. It's in fact something about the male. What's that?
Why is it worded like that? I mean, that doesn't make sense to say that women are evil.
No, the Prophet ﷺ never says that women are evil. There's no, and also another thing, these are bad translations, because a lot of times they talk about shar, and I mentioned that shar in Arabic is not a moral. It has to do with more with a want than it has to do with the idea of evil, right? I mean, there's some, I've seen this in the Muslim books, and personally I don't, it bothers me, you know.
Is Al-Ghazali just saying that both men and women should have purified parts before they get married? Is that what he's saying?
Definitely they should at least be on the path of attempting to purify their hearts. You know, I don't think that you should delay marriage until you have, you know, feel like you're in a state of purity or ikhlas or something like that. You know, you might end up getting married at about 60 or 70. Right? And Allah's also made, you know, there's natural attractions. Lust is part of the human condition. That is a natural attraction between a male and a female. That's not something abnormal. It's not something bad. What the Sharia is saying is, if you can't control that, you're in trouble. You have to be able to control it. Then the idea is that you will not be susceptible to falling into something that is a major wrong action, because your taqwa, the mechanism within your soul, will prevent you from doing that.
Why does it seem like the woman is controlling it for both themselves and themselves?
I think there's more of an onus on women. I really do. In the Sharia, I definitely do. And I think in a sense it really is saying that I mean, Maryam is praised for being chaste. And Yusuf also is being praised for being chaste, right? But really, when you think of chastity, you think of Maryam alayhi salam before you think of Yusuf. That there's a, you know, the afifa, what's called afifa, it's something that is very, very, and then men have a type of veiling that women don't have, right? Which is not necessarily good. It's just that happens. Laysa dhakaru ka untha. You know, the Quran says the male is not like the female. And that ayah is not saying the male is better than the female. It's that within a social context, there are certain things, and they're dangerous for the male, because if people that don't have taqwa will abuse those differences, right? And that does happen. Well, for instance, there are many men historically who have had premarital relations. They're veiled. They go and they get married, and they used to call it in this culture sowing his wild oats, right? Whereas when a woman does that, it's very easy to get pregnant. She's labeled as a bad woman. Whereas from Sharia point of view, there's absolutely no distinction between the zina of a male or a female. And I had a very strong argument with somebody about this, who was from a Muslim country, and there was a Libyan man with me who was agreeing with me, that for him, his son or his daughter was the same, and this other person was saying, no, the daughter, it's worse. And I say, it's not worse in Sharia, it's worse in social stigma because of the nature of the woman. In other words, there's this idea that, it's a deep breach of the social contract, but the male is a breach, and it takes two to tango. Right? Huh? So, I mean, these are double standards, and they're not going to go away. There's something, this has been within the human condition for a long, long time. And this is why the Sharia, really, there's a lot of preventive measures. The idea of not being alone with a woman, the khalwa. Right? And it goes for the same, a woman can't be alone with a man. It's one of the things a lot of women in this culture, if a man doesn't shake the hand, they immediately assume, I'm unclean, the woman. Whereas a Muslim woman can't shake a male's hand. It's the same way, but the interpretation is always seen from that perspective. And this is part of the problem in our behavior as Muslims and in our articulation of our teaching, right? Is that there are gross misconceptions, not only outside of the Islamic community, but inside the Islamic community as well. And that's where a lot of the source of the problem is, that there is jahiliyyah. There is this kind of patriarchal nonsense going on that is not honoring women, right? And you know, the tradition says, لا يكرمهن إلا كريم ولا يهينهن إلا لئيم, that only noble men honor women and only wretched men dishonor them, you know? So, I mean, this is part of our challenge, to start changing some of these cycles, breaking, right? And I think it's possible. It just takes a lot of work and effort.
What's the meaning of afifa in English?
Afifa is like, iffa is a type of, it's chastity, but it's related to, you know, afifa is somebody who's vigilant about her honor, her name, right?
And what's the difference between that and zina?
Zina just means, it means illicit relations, whether it's adultery, which is between a married person or two married people, and fornication, which is people that aren't married. And the hadd is worse for married people, obviously, than it is for unmarried people.
Male family members, like a cousin, would the same rule apply as far as like being alone with her?
If you can marry the person, the rule applies. That's the general rule. If you can marry them, if there is a potential possibility, even if at the given point you can't marry them, but because of divorce or death you could marry them, it has the same application. So, like, you know, my brother might be married to a woman, and at that time I can't marry her. But if my brother died or if my brother was divorced, then I could marry her. So in that situation, she's ajnabiyya. I can't marry her. Or my wife has a sister. I can't marry my wife's sister. But if my wife, if there was a divorce or a death, then I could. So if there's either the possibility of marriage, immediate possibility, or potential possibility, then that is ajnabiyya for male and female. The male is ajnabi and the female is ajnabiyya.
If you're living in the same house.
Doesn't matter. Nope. Sharia is really strict about those things.
Like if you're living with your husband's brother, or you're living with your husband,
Bad
or your
news.
cousin.
Bad news. Really, bad news. Arhamul maut, the Prophet said, you know, brother-in-laws are death. You know, it's bad news. Human beings are human beings. I guarantee you, within this culture, a lot of the stuff that goes on is, you know, it's not Oprah Winfrey, but the other type, you know, soap operas, you know, these Morich Povey or whatever, you know, these type of things. No, it's all about, you know, brother steals, you know, wife, right, and stuff like that. And it's all because of these type close intimacies. It happens all the time in this culture, things like that. You know, and most of the illicit relationships happen in workspaces. In other words, you know, here's a woman or a man who's, you know, he's been married 7 or 8 years, getting kind of quote unquote boring. They call it 7-year itch. You know, and he's working, and he's, you know, he's got this woman he's working with, and she's really interesting. They have really interesting conversations, and he's thinking, you know, why can't I have a conversation like this with my wife? You know, and then, or maybe she's never been married before, and, you know, the wife's had 2 or 3 children. She doesn't look as good as she did when he first married her, right? And this woman, she looks really good, and this is how it all happens, you know. Or the woman says, this guy's so much more interesting than my husband, you know, or he pays attention to me. You know, like I was on the airplane, and there was this woman with her husband was sitting across from me, and they had a couple kids, and he was reading, he was an MD, and he was reading a magazine about football. And then, you know, he'd been reading it for half the flight, so she says to him, is the magazine good? Do you like it? You know, sweetheart? Blah, blah, blah. And he's just, So I think she said it again, no response. And I just looked at her and I said, my wife hates when I do that, you know. And she said, you just get used to it, you know, right? My wife actually counts because I have this kind of delayed, you know, my reticular formation picks up the, you know, after about 10 seconds. So she'll ask me a question when I'm reading, and then she'll just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then for about 10 seconds I'll say, oh, I think this or that, you know, and she just shakes her head.
In this culture to sit down with a man, since in this culture that's just the normal.
Well, see, that's an example of urf that goes against the Sharia. Yeah.
What's the question?
You're not supposed to shake hands with people. And that is the hukum, you know, and sometimes, you know, that's a really difficult one. Just sometimes, because it's almost like it's become spontaneous, you know, it's just, and it's really hard to, somebody puts their hand right in front of your hand. And I mean, I had one of my shaykhs who has a lot of taqwa, but he had to go, he went on this, you know, he was sent by the government to Russia, and he went to, I think, Kazakhstan or one of Nuristan, Kazakhstan, I think, and he was really bothered by, you know, the protocol and things like that, because he was representing the United Arab Emirates, so there's, you know, diplomatic concerns and things. But he, when he got to Kazakhstan, when they came out, you know, they were shaking the hands, and he came to the wife of the president, you know, and his hand was there, and she just went like this, you know, like, I can't shake your hand. So it was kind of, he said it was a big shock for him just to kind of, he said, astaghfirullah, you know, that the woman didn't want to shake his hand because she was a Muslim. Yeah.
What do you do in that situation? Because there was a situation
That's a big problem, and I think the most important thing is to try to explain. It could actually become an opportunity for da'wah. I mean, I don't think you have to go into the fact, you know, well, did you know that sexual pheromones are transmitted through touch and things like that?
No, because there was a situation where there was a mosque and they invited the neighbors for some Eid, you know, lunch or brunch or something, and then, you know, some of the ladies came over and you know, she stretched out her hand, you know, to this guy, and she's like, I can't touch you, you're a lady, you know, and she got so offended.
Yeah, no.
She got so offended, she said, I'll never ever come to you Muslims ever. I'll never, you know. So, I mean,
yeah, it's a very
counterproductive.
sensitive issue, and I think there definitely needs to be more awareness within the community. And one of the things is, that's part of the thing about going to high schools and going to, and explaining, you know, there's opportunities like 7th grade, 9th grade, going to high schools, explaining to people, and bringing up that issue.
You say that, what is the consequences? I mean, one thing, you lose your wudu. That's for sure.
If you're Shafi'i, not if you're Maliki.
But let's say you lose your wudu. This is a consequence. But what
in Maliki, you don't lose your wudu.
Let's say you don't. What is the consequence of shaking? You go to hellfire right there. You know what are you losing by what? How?
It's not a major wrong action. It's not like kabira. It doesn't go under the mubiqat or the kaba'ir like that. But it's
not haram, right?
It's prohibited. There is a nahi. Yes. About the qabda. Yeah, I know. But I mean, there is a nahi, definitely. And it's taken from the ayah, قُلْ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ, what's called mafhum al-awla. The Quran says lower the gaze, and mafhum al-awla in tafsir is, like for instance in the Quran it says not to say to your parents, uff. Well, from that the scholars take that you certainly can't hit them. If you can't say uff to them, you definitely can't hit them, because it's mafhum al-awla. It's even something you should understand even more, that if saying uff is prohibited, then certainly to say, to hit them is prohibited. And the Quran, when it says tell them to lower the eyes, well, touch is much, it's a stronger, and that's where, and there is a sound hadith that the Prophet never once touched an ajnabiya woman, ever. Ever. He did not touch any woman that he was not directly related to or had rights over in terms of, you know, sexual rights.
His tradition of what happens if you do touch a woman, you lose or not lose your wudu, that means that there's a place for it. If they talk about that if you touch a woman, this happens.
But, well, because people do it, and you find it in a lot of cultures, even Muslim cultures, like Morocco is a good example. It's an urf there. Doesn't mean it's permissible, but it does happen. You know, it's very common. And there's not a, you know, there's no, you know, sexuality involved in it or anything, but it's a barrier that the Sharia has put there between males and females.
From what I recall, I believe there is a narration, hadith, riwayah about the severity of the punishment of someone who does touch an ajnabi.
Well, you have to get into what's intention and things like that. You know, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. And yeah, there are some strong hadiths, but again, you know, you just, I don't know, there's something that one of my shaykhs called Faqr-e-Ghayoor, which is the jurisprudence of reality, you know, and recognize that there's a lot of people that are just, you know, it's part, within this culture, there's situations where people find themselves in, you know, where things are compromised. It's not in any way saying it's right or correct or things like that, but these are situations that need to be remedied, and the way that they're remedied is through education, information. That is the way they're remedied.
But in that immediate situation, wouldn't that be considered compelling circumstances?
Well, I don't know. I can't give a fatwa about that. I mean, I just can't. You know, I don't know. I couldn't.
That's a good way of explaining it to someone who does.
Well, what I told my wife is that you need to explain, you know, that it's, you know, it's both ways. It's not just coming. It's not the man. It's not that the woman's bad, because this is what the women. Because it's like, oh, this confirms all my fears of. Because she'll go to the woman, the Muslim woman, and she'll shake her hand. But then she goes to the man, he won't shake her hand. So she's like, you know, this is exactly what I read in Newsweek. It's true. There really are like this, you know. So it becomes this kind of confirmation for some preconceived prejudices and biases, right? And we're dealing with a lot, you know. You're not coming to a table where, oh, I don't know anything about your religion. Let's see what it's like to spend time with a Muslim. No, it's, oh, Muslim. Yeah, I've read about you people. You know, and then it's going to start, the littlest things are going to be interpreted as confirming that very thing. You know, he didn't shake my hand. You see, they don't like women. Right? No, seriously, this is the way people think. And it's odd because another thing is like, you know, in the idea of not looking at the women, which a lot of men, Muslim men do that, of not giving eye contact, which in this culture is, that means you're ignoring me. Or generally for a woman it's going to be, he didn't give me any acknowledgement, right? I mean, is that the way a woman's going to perceive that?
People interpret it as disrespect.
Disrespect, and also oftentimes dishonesty, right? You're dealing with cultural interpretations. For instance, in Latino culture, for a woman to look at, a younger woman to look at a man's eyes is seen as almost like a flirtation, or, you know, that there is. In traditional Latino culture, it's disencouraged for a woman. They will oftentimes avert their glance from men. So, you know, you're dealing with cultural sensitivities. But for the Americans, if you look me in the eye, give me a firm handshake, right? An American wants that. He doesn't want this kind of limp hand. You know, no, he wants a firm handshake. And when you talk to me in the eye, right? Because he wants to feel you're being honest with him. But if he sees you kind of looking away or something, what's he hiding? Really, that's the way. So you're dealing with cultural norms, and they're very powerful. And you know, I don't know. I've read, you know, in some 80% of communication is nonverbal. Wallahu ta'ala alam. A good percentage of it is. I don't know if it's that high, but a good percentage of communication is nonverbal, and you have to be aware of who you're talking to and what sign language means, because from children, a cultural sign language is being learned, and you can't just discard it. That's why they have whole courses on cultural sensitivity. They have people that come into corporations and teach managers who are working with Indians, for instance, right? Or because Indians have a completely different relationship to hierarchical structures than in the Indian subcontinent. You don't challenge your boss. Simple as that, right? I mean, you do not. The boss is always right, right? Whereas in America, oftentimes the manager will expect that you give him quote unquote feedback. You go to the university and they pass out a thing to you evaluate your professor, right? I mean, in the East, like in the Arab world or in Pakistan, the student evaluate the teacher? I mean, that would be seen as the height of disrespect, right? So you're dealing with very different cultural norms. And li ta'arafu, Allah created us so that we come to know one another. It's not necessarily that the norms in this country are wrong, but they are related to the culture, right? They're related to the culture. And so Muslims coming here have to, in a sense, recognize that. And there is a type of arrogance in coming to a place and just imposing your rules, if they're cultural. If they're Sharia, no, you have to establish your position. But if they're cultural, there's a type of arrogance in coming into a culture and not being willing to recognize that I need to learn about these people so that I don't offend them when I talk to them, so that I don't, right? I mean, that's on us to learn that. What's appropriate, what's inappropriate, because different cultures have different things. You go to Saudi Arabia, for you to point your feet at somebody, it's disrespect. In Mauritania, it's not at all. In Syria or places like that, if you're in a class and you're not completely up and attentive, you're showing gross disrespect to the teacher. And same in Japan or Asia. If you're in Africa, it's not the case. So you have different. What's that?
Africa is unique in that sense.
Africa is very laid back. Africa is, I like Africa. It's just kind of they're very relaxed and they're not uptight, and they really aren't. West Africans are very relaxed. And I personally, I feel much more comfortable with that. And part of it is, I was telling I was playing ball with my children in the living room, throwing it off the wall. And my wife came in and she said, "Did your parents let you do that?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "Did they let you just play in the living room like that?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "What about you?" She said, "No, that was off limits. The living room was off limits." And I said, "Well, there you have really struck at the core of the reason why the Americans are ruling the world, because they think they can play wherever they want. There's just no rules, right?" So there, you're dealing with a lot of variables, and the challenge for us is to really kind of maintain to the best of our ability. Attaqullah mastata'tum. Have taqwa of Allah, as much as you're able to. What's that, Usma? What?
Didn't you say that one of the 5 categories, things about fiqh that you talked about yesterday, wasn't one of them had to do with cultural norms?
Norms. Al-urf muhkam. Al-'ada muhkama. Yes, a norm is binding. In other words, and a norm is, in the Maliki madhab in particular, norms are honored. The cultural norms of a people are honored. Islam does not want to uproot cultures. It doesn't want to turn everybody into Arabs. That is not the intention behind Sharia.
But that's after Sharia. Or is that if there's a
conflict, then the Sharia is rules. But if there's no conflict, then the urf of a people is honored.
But when a faqih makes a decision, he has to include the urf.
He has to understand the urf of the people.
Sometimes madhab will be related to a certain urf, the way they took on, let's say, lowering the gaze.
No, that's a good point.
Lowering the gaze has to do with that urf. Maybe lowering the gaze will mean something else in America.
Yeah.
Right. What's that? Yeah. What's that?
What would your view be? I mean, being here like a cultural norm in America, what would your view be?
About what?
As far as like lowering the gaze, or I mean,
I personally think that you know, the Prophet ﷺ lowered his gaze, and that was also outside of the norm of his culture. In other words, men in his culture did not lower the gaze, but it was his character to lower his gaze, and that is indicating that there's something good in that, to lower the gaze. He did not look at men either, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, they said that his modesty was like a virgin who was still cloistered, you know, who hadn't come out of her parents' house. And if you know traditional culture, that is a very intense modesty. And that was his character. He was like a, you know, his modesty was like a young girl coming into puberty, you know, in a traditional culture. Very, very modest by his nature, right? And I think our culture, this culture, the American culture, which I grew up in, has really lost completely the value of modesty. We look at it either as a neuroses that needs to be removed. Seriously. Like women by nature, you know, they do have modesty, and I think it's more than socialization, and I think the children do as well. You know, children want to have some privacy about certain things, right? And I know somebody who told me that he raised his children, you know, that there was no nakedness in the, you know, that everything, and he said at a certain point, they just did not want to play by those rules anymore. His children, they wanted to change the rules. We don't want to be naked around you, right? So, you know, I think that the people can do a lot of damage in trying to force, like, for instance, you know, there's a whole thing where you have to force people to talk in front of other people, right? There's this idea in classrooms that the ones that don't talk, you know, that's not a good sign, that's a bad sign. From the Islamic point of view, it's actually a good sign. Now, there could be some damage there. Really, you could be dealing with some trauma that related to how they were raised, and there's no doubt about that. But you could be dealing with a very modest person by their nature. You know, there might not have been any trauma there. It might simply be that is their character, and that's a really good thing. It's a very beautiful thing, and it should be honored and appreciated, and they should not be forced to become gregarious and outgoing. You see, because the Americans they respect gregariousness, right? Really, they do. They respect, you know, the will to power, you know, the individual, right? Horatio Alger, you know, go out and make it happen. And a lot of the cultures that respect a type of almost a passivity in nature, it's just not honored here, which I think is unfortunate for the Americans, because I think there's a lot of really, you know, and I remember once I was in West Africa, and there were these two sisters close in age, and one talked all the time, and the other never talked. And I said to in fact, the man that's coming, Sheikh Abdullah, today, I said to him, it's interesting how different they are. You know, she talks all the time, that one never talks. And he pointed to the one that didn't talk, and it said, yeah, it seems like she's more intelligent. And I said, that's exactly the opposite of what, like, somebody would say in America. It was the talkative one that was intelligent. And he looked at me like he could not grasp that. And he said, why would they think that? I mean, he said too much speech is an indication of khifat al-aql, that there's a weakness in the aql, that silence is an indication of gravity, of a type of depth.
Like even in my university classes, part of your grade is class participation.
Absolutely. If you don't participate, your grade goes down. Even if the person is brilliant, understand they could get straight A's on the tests, you're not participating. And that's a really good example of where an American cultural norm is going to affect.
The teacher will look at you expecting you to participate because they notice that you haven't.
Right.
To make sure that your understanding of what is being taught.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
On the category, when number 5, as you said, norms are binding, and that.
Well, they're binding in terms of like divorce and things like that. They're not binding. You don't have to follow the urf of your people. They're not binding in that way, but they are binding in things that relate to Sharia.
Like, for example...
But they're honored by Sharia. Imam Malik definitely says that the urf is, wa'mar bil urf. The Quran says, command people to the norms, as long as the norms don't go against the society.
Like, what about in countries like in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, back there, when they have large families living in one house, for example?
Yeah.
I mean, that's where, like, actually the husband will get married and he'll bring them into the mother's house and stuff.
All right. By Sharia, a woman has a right to have her own living space. That is a Sharia right. If she is willing to live according to the custom, that's her prerogative. She can do that, or she can say, no, I demand that I have my own house. That is a haqq of a woman, infirad fil maskan. She can say, I don't want to live with your parents. And I think in certain cultures, there's even in, like Afghanistan, there's a lot of problems that go with that, right? When you have, it's true or not true? I mean, there are problems that arise out of that.
I don't know, I haven't personally...
Where's Azizullah? Aren't there problems that arise from that? Huh? Do you think? Be honest. Yeah. There are problems that come out of that, because it's a human nature. Oftentimes you get an overweening mother or overbearing mother that, you're not good enough for my son. You're not living up to,
Oh, yeah, experiences like that. No,
that happens, and it can be very traumatic for a woman. That can be very traumatic for a woman.
I have a friend, his dad passed away, was killed actually, and he doesn't want to lose his mother, because his mother lived in one house, and the rest of the children already married.
Right.
Have their own houses. And he also doesn't want to lose the wife also.
Right. So there's a conflict.
Yeah, he want to get out, but he doesn't want to say to his mother.
Right.
And in instances like that, you've got to fulfill your mother's rights. Does mother's rights come before the rights of your wife?
No. Because
Sharia rules over, the culture in that essence, right?
Absolutely. Sharia is over culture. Sharia is binding unless the norm relates to Sharia judgments that recognize the urf.
Sharia is saying that you've got to fulfill your mother's rights as well. You've got to take care of your mother.
You have to fulfill your mother's rights, but also you have to fulfill your wife's rights, right? You can't. You can't. The wife has rights, and one of the rights is that she had. Yeah, and if that means that you provide 2 places, then that. Now a woman's encouraged to give and take there, but she doesn't have to. She would get a reward for it. In Sharia, if she did it for the sake of Allah, then she gets a reward for it. But she doesn't have to do that. Yeah. Now, obviously, if a man's mother needs to be taken care of, and he's responsible for the mother. If he's the first son, right? He's responsible for the mother. And if he's not able to do it, then the other males in the family, they're responsible to take care of the mother, which is an honor. It's an honor.
Like in some circumstances, it becomes necessary that, for example, there's no father, and the mother is just single. You can't leave the mother in a separate home after marriage. So is it like, do you think it is more...
Well, you could, but if they're living in a Muslim place, you could, but it would be, it would not be customary in most Muslim countries to do that. What's that?
They're not customary, as far as Sharia is concerned. Like you are leaving your mother on side, you are...
Yeah, no, you should take care of your mother, right? But if your mother wanted to live on her own, if you were there where you could help her, take care of her needs and things like that, there's, as long as it's in a safe environment, things like that. But if the proper thing, given the urf of the Muslims and the responsibilities related to the mother, is taking care of the mother in her old age. That's a given in Islam. The Prophet ﷺ, one man was changing his mother's linen, because she was decrepit, and he asked the Prophet if that was birr, was that piety, filial piety to the mother, and the Prophet said no, that's just recompension. You're just doing to her what she did to you when you were a baby. Now she's in her old age. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Your parents are your parents, whether they're Muslim or not.
When we read that paradise lies under the feet of the mother.
Absolutely.
I think personally that it's more better if you take care of mother and keep her with you instead of putting her in a separate.
No, you should. Yeah, definitely that would be what, unless that she didn't want to. There are reasons why she wouldn't want to.
If your wife doesn't want to, in that instance.
And your mother does. I mean,
let me wait till Sheikh Abdullah comes in. He can answer that question for you.
There's also a difference between if your parents need to be cared for, or if it's out of your parent, you want the person to live in your home, and your parents are still of sound health.
And then there's some meddling parents, right? I mean, that is a phenomenon. You get meddling parents. That's a phenomenon. You get the mother that she comes in and takes over and stuff. It happens. I mean, we have to be realistic.
Yeah.
That does happen, and it becomes very disruptive for marital situations, right? I mean, it does happen. And it does, some marriages actually break down because of that. And I've seen it with my own eyes, within Muslim families. It's just disastrous, so.
That's why they invented the in-law apartment, where you can have some separation, but you also have a
The in-law apartment. No, absolutely. It's called an in-law. Even to this day, to build a small, in most zonings, if you have a house, you can build, even though it's an R1, like it's residential 1, you can very easily get zoning for what's called an in-law outlet, which is, the idea is that it's not a house on its own, but it's a place where one of the parents or the parents could live in their old age. And that's true. And I'll give you another. The truth is that many of the Muslim houses were designed for sacred space. They were designed, if you go to traditional houses, you will see that they were designed to accommodate more than one family with the necessary observances of the courtesies of Sharia, right? Whereas now you get people living in apartments, where there's no space at all, and it becomes very kind of incestuous, and just it's very difficult to function. Now, for some people, these are just necessities. I mean, you have a lot of people in these cultures where it's just necessity. And I think also, again, this is urf, because, for instance, in some cultures, the families being in that tight space is, it's not a problem, whereas with other cultures, it is, right? And certainly, I mean, the family unity and the family binding is much stronger in Muslim culture than it is in non-Muslim culture. And even within this culture, within minorities, minorities being other than the dominant, which is soon to be, a minority itself, but the dominant white or Anglo culture, you'll still find family ties are stronger. Family ties, I mean, for most Muslims, the vast majority of Muslims, the idea of putting your parents into an old folks' home is just anathema. I mean, just not. Muslims just shake their head. They can't understand that, right? They really can't. Whereas in this culture, there's no stigma attached to it anymore. I mean, personally, my family, and I don't know if it's, the remnants of the Greek background or what, but I don't think any of my immediate, like my brothers and sisters, could imagine that, personally. I really don't. But there's certainly a lot of families that do. And one of the things I noticed when I was working in the hospital is that there's the Chinese people would be sick. And, when you're working like as an RN, the Asian patients were always kind of a blessing, because the family would take care of them. You know, literally, they would feed them. They'd oftentimes bring their own food in. They'd wash them. They didn't want you washing their mother. You know, it's my mother. I don't want a stranger washing my mother. They would do all that stuff. And same with the African American. You would see that more. There'd be more visitors. There'd be more. Mexican, definitely. A lot of the Anglo or the white, they'd be in the hospital for days and not get a visitor. Very common, seriously. And you know, I just saw this all the time.
If they do, they prefer the nurse to watch.
Exactly. What was that?
I was just going to say, at the same time, they would want to be careful about stereotyping too, because if you're a white American, you would not want to do that to your parents. I mean, especially if you become Muslim, you know, and you don't want to do that to your parents. We would want to be careful about that too, to just not assume that because we're American, we would want to do that.
No, I totally agree with that. But it's common in this culture. It's not uncommon. That's the point. It's not a shock for, you know, if somebody, you know, if you hear from somebody in this culture, oh, I was visiting my mother at, at the rest home or something like that. That's not a shock. Whereas a Muslim, to say that within a group of Muslims, it would just be like, what? You know, I mean, I'm not making this up. So I agree with that. And I would say that my family personally, I think that would be shocking if one of us suggested that about our parents.
I mean, some of that, and doesn't that have to do with like such a strong binding within the family? I mean,
Islamic,
part of that has to do with growing up together in that same house, you know, and that attachment comes from growing up together.
I think, the extended family's stronger still, but that used to be the way in this country. Don't forget that. See, this is not, family in this country is, we're seeing the breakdown of the culture, right? We're seeing the breakdown of the culture. There was a time in this country that parents lived in the house. Really, it wasn't that long ago. There was a time when you did have these type of family bonds. And I think that you will see them begin to break down within the Muslims that moved to this country after it's already starting to happen. Second, third generation. Seriously, don't think we're immune to it as Muslims, right?
In our culture.
Oh, what's that?
It's called ABCD. It means American born, confused, and D means native, basically.
Right. So, I think that the generation of Americans that grew up in this country in, say, the 30s and 40s, it was very different. The breakdown starts, it's a post-war, it's related to the post-war phenomenon, and it really becomes exacerbated in the 60s, and then, the baby boomers coming of age. There's a lot of breakdown going on in this culture. And old folks' homes are, they're recent phenomenons. They're not, it's not something traditionally that...
And it works the other way around also, that old people say, I don't want my kids to take care of me.
There are a lot of parents that don't. They would see it as actually something undignified for them. That's true. Because there's a lot, that's another thing. I'm glad you brought that up. It's a very good point. That there are a lot of people in this country that do have a sense, of pride, of not, I don't want to be, because, again, we go back to that idea of independence, individuality, I can take care of myself. There's a very strong sense of that, sense of self in this culture. And the idea that I am going to become dependent on my children is, that's quite horrifying for many, many people. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that's another way of looking at it, is that that is true. There are people that really would rather have a nurse taking care of them than their children, especially if they could afford the nurse,
And many of those people had their grandparents in their household.
Right.
And
yeah.
Being married Islamically or legally be a cultural norm too. Like my friend, she got married Islamically, then she went also to get married.
Well, that's related to just certain, in Sharia, we're what are called, I mean, I don't consider myself in this category, but I would consider any immigrant that comes here what's called a musta'man, which is somebody who comes into a country who, if the conditions of coming into the country are that they honor the laws of the country, that by Sharia is binding upon them to honor those laws. If they grew up here, then I think there's probably, they should follow the laws as long as to break the laws would jeopardize them in any way. In other words, if to not pay your taxes is going to jeopardize your condition and possibly put you in a situation where you would be subject to criminal prosecution, no, you must do that. But a musta'man who comes into the country, it is binding on them to follow laws by Sharia. And if the laws go against the Sharia, they make hijrah. If they're not going to follow them, they make hijrah. Right? So technically, really a Muslim who came from another country could not be polygamous in this country. Because there's a law against that in this country. Right? Well, that's another matter, because then you're getting into that it was not a choice to come here. And then really at that point you either make hijrah or you should, you should live within the laws of the land. I mean, Sharia honors law, definitely. What it does not honor is law that breaks the law of Allah, but it honors laws, masalih. Now, if you come into a place where the laws are not the laws of Islam, but you're coming in under the condition that you will obey the laws, then you must obey the laws or leave, make hijrah. Simple as that.
So are they going against Sharia? Since it's not legal to have
I think there should probably be some serious study about that, and I'm not going to give a fatwa, but generally what I was taught is that you must obey the laws of a land. And so I think it's an area of concern. It is an area of concern. Voting, boy, that's just a big can of worms for voting. Voting. I mean, I have a real problem with voting personally, but I was like against voting before I became Muslim. Right? Don't vote, it only encourages them. Right? I think local participation is just, it's necessary. In other words, I think that it's foolish for Muslims to be living in local communities and not involved in the local political process, because it affects us. And you can impact at a local level your situation in terms of zoning, in terms of rights of Muslims, in terms of school districts, in terms of, there are a lot of things that Muslims can do. And to say, oh, we're not getting involved, this is kufr and this, well then go, make hijrah. But if you're here, you have to deal with the reality of your circumstance. And in Sharia, one of the rules that we didn't go over is called irtikab khaf ad-dararain, which is taking the lesser of two evils. So if you look in Sharia gives you guidance even when there's no guidance, right? It tells you what to do in circumstances even where, for instance, we would say that the political process that is other than the law of Allah it's a shar, it's an evil. But given that you have a body of Muslims that are affected by it, is there a greater benefit in participating in it or in not participating in it? And that is how the Sharia will look at it, because it can take the lesser of two evils. I'm just giving you an argument. This is an usuli argument. This is not my position. I'm just telling you that it's not black and white. It's not cut and dry. You've got some Muslims that say, haram, you're a kafir. If you do this, you're showing allegiance to a taghut, etc., etc. That's an extreme position, right? And it's highly impractical in terms of local government. Muslims should have good relationships with city councils, with the police department, things like that. Really, we should, because we're living in these communities and it impacts us. It affects us. It's important for Muslims to reach out to the police departments and do educational. They do it. Like, we've done this in our community. We've gone there. You know, I went there and I taught these policemen. I told them about stopping Muslims. You know, that for a lot of Muslims it's a traumatic experience because they're coming out of countries where police, you know, they can just take them, literally. You know, and boom, they disappear. Their family never sees them again. It happens in Muslim countries, right? So there are Muslims that have that psychic baggage with them. They get stopped by a police and suddenly it's like they start sweating and it has nothing to do with the cop. It has to do with previous experiences that are being repeated. The cop will sense this because police are very sensitive to when somebody's nervous, right? And he'll start thinking, okay, this is a Middle Easterner, this guy could be a terrorist, you know, seriously, this is what's going on. You're dealing with human beings with a lot of psychic baggage. And so going out and talking to these people, letting them know, you know, the vast majority of Muslims you're going to deal with are law-abiding people. They don't want problems. They'd probably hope that you let them off if you stop them and don't give them a ticket, just like anybody else, you know. And there's some, I mean, I know this Palestinian friend of mine, he was with this Palestinian guy that was literally just, you know, kind of off the airplane or whatever. And this policeman stopped them. And this guy had never gotten a ticket because he was a Vietnam vet. He was Palestinian, he was a Vietnam vet. So he like had these sob stories and stuff. But he told the guy, let me handle this. And this guy said, no, let me handle this. You know, and he started like screaming at this cop. You know, we weren't doing anything wrong, and what do you think you are? And he had him out of the car and frisking them and doing all that. And this other guy's just shaking his head, you know. Middle Eastern mentality coming up against, you know, the cool kind of rational, you know. Seriously, that's the way they perceive it. It's a hot-headed Arab, right?
The reason that people tell me that they don't participate in religion and other things within the community is because that Muslims are not supposed to live in a non-Islamic state unless they're seeking education or some other reason to be there, but they're not permanent residents there. Is that true? No, I'm not saying personally. It's all.
Yeah, see, I think a lot of people that bring these arguments, again, are, you know, it's the Clark Kent syndrome. It's like, you know, they're getting all the perks and they're not dealing with any of the, I really do. And they say, oh, it's permissible to come here for education, and they haven't learned their fard ayn. It's not it's haram to learn a kifaya knowledge when you haven't learned ayn. And the vast majority of Muslims I know in this country have never learned their fard ayn. So I don't know. I mean, I just think, you know, there's a thing in psychology called cognitive dissonance, which is, you know, when you're inward and your outward behavior, it goes against your inward beliefs. And what will generally happen is your inward beliefs are those that will shift in order to maintain a psychic integrity. So what happens is people start justifying, you know, what they're doing there. And we are delusional creatures. We are deluded very easily by our nature. And you just have to be very careful not to get into that kind of delusional state where, you know, and Muslims are as susceptible to self-righteousness as any other religious community, right? I mean, there's a lot of very self-righteous Muslims out there who, you know, they're just filled with themselves and they think there's some innate moral superiority by the simple fact that they're Muslim, right? Which is not true. The Quran says, فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. Allah tells the different religions, vie with one another in righteous actions. In other words, prove that you're better by your actions, not just by your words, right? So, what time is it?
The Muslims have to be taught like UK and South Africa.
What's that?
The Muslims have to be taught like how in UK, I mean, they're active participants in everything. So they've got their rights now. I mean, quite a bit of it.
In South Africa.
Yeah.
They're very strong in South Africa.
I mean, the community,
right.
The police and everything.
Yeah.
And even in the UK now, in England.
Yeah.
Well,
Islam is a recent phenomenon in America, really. I mean, there is a strain of Islam, particularly within the African American community. You know, Islam has been around. Sun Yang was telling us about a Sudanese man who was spreading Sunni Islam in the 1930s, Philadelphia. So Islam has been here, but it's never been a recognizable constituency within the American experience. And so we're really just, we are the pioneers here. You know, we're trying to find out what our place is within the dominant culture, and so there's a lot of things to be worked out. And we're also, unfortunately, in a bad condition generally. The Muslim, our level of education, not necessarily Western secular education, but Islamic education, is very low, extremely low. It's low all over the world, and it's particularly low here, because we don't have very many scholars. We don't have very many people that are really, trained in Sharia. And so, we've got a lot of learning to go through, and a lot of challenges.
If you take that, as a big consideration, what is going to happen is you have people that do not know anything who take the top positions, and then it will be worse.
Well, I don't know what you mean.
There are people who do not know much about Sharia, who do not know Islamic law,
Right.
maybe they understand a little or whatever, and then they would become big.
Yeah, no, this is
this is what is happening. I've seen this.
This is a big trouble, yeah.
So therefore, those that know whoever, whether a small amount or whatever.
And then there's a lot of Muslims in the States that think that, we can just put everything on a computer and we can do away with, you can just literally work it out on your computer.
I think a major difference in trying to, I don't know if I'm going to use the word revive Islam in America, but there's a difference as far as the foundation or the origin of Islam, for example, in the US versus like South Africa. In South Africa, when Muslims went there, they went for the specific purpose of da'wah. And here, when people come to the US, they don't come with that reason. So if we change that value, if we change that reason, then they will be...
You think they did initially?
Yeah, because there were a lot of shuyukh actually. The first Muslims who came were shuyukh, who established madrasas and so forth in Islam. Although they came...
weren't they immigrating there for work reasons and things?
No, they came in the disguise of being slaves, but most of the slaves were shuyukh actually, coming to spread Islam.
Sounds fishy.
I don't know.
I was talking to Abdullah about taxes and the responsibility of paying or not paying taxes.
Yeah.
He says a Muslim is you're not responsible to pay taxes if you don't have to. And I said, is this because it's a non-Muslim country? He says, no, even in a Muslim country, taxes of the state, if you can avoid paying it, you don't pay it.
What's called income tax in classical Islam is definitely prohibited. Yeah, there's no income tax in Islam. Again, by Sharia, you cannot jeopardize yourself. So there's an example where a darura would override. Do you see what I mean? In other words, if by not paying taxes you are going to jeopardize your freedom, you'll be incarcerated. Your family will not have a provider. Then that's a worse evil than the evil of taxes. Do you see what I mean? So I think you have to be really careful with that. Yeah. The best thing you do is just live very frugally, make less than $10,000 a year, and you don't have to pay taxes.
Isn't that because the expectations that zakat will take care of?
No, I don't think so. Zakat. Certainly, if agricultural zakat is implemented, you will not have want in food, most definitely. If agricultural zakat was implemented in the Muslim world, you would not have any want anywhere on the planet, right? So agricultural zakat definitely eliminates poverty, 10 or 5% depending on what type of irrigation you use, and then also livestock. There's zakat on livestock. In terms of the wealth, actually, 1/40th is a lot. If you took 1/40th of the Muslim capital wealth in the world, you're dealing with massive amounts of capital. Massive. 1/40th of, I mean, if you just took 1/40th of capital wealth of Arabia alone, seriously, you're dealing with massive wealth. And then also, I think there's a strong argument, rikaz in the Hanafi madhab, buried treasure, minerals and things like that, is 20% wealth. And some say no, it completely goes to the Bayt al-Mal, that it's for. So mineral wealth would be for the good of the society, right? But historically there have been very few instances when the Muslims lived without taxes. Very few. The Murabitun period was one of them. Taxes over and above the Sharia taxes, right?
You mentioned that the paper money is related to riba. Right. Can you explain how exactly it's related?
That's a whole.
Can you give some general?
Well, I mean, at the most basic level is that the U.S. government presents a budget, and then the budget, they're allowed to print money. They're allowed to spend money based on interest-bearing bonds, treasury bonds. They're called treasury bonds. Solomon Brothers is a major trader in treasury bonds. They sell them to the Americans, they sell them to the Japanese, before, and to the Arabians. Before income tax, which is 1913, right? The income tax law is enacted. Before income tax, this country supported itself through bonds, right? So patriotic Americans would buy, when there was a need, like if there was a war, they would have war bonds, and you would buy war bonds that would support the government's activities, right? So graduated income tax, which is, it's a communist idea originally. That's one of the points of the Communist Manifesto, was to introduce graduated income tax into society.
The mosque requesting that you pay your zakat to the masjid.
Yeah, you don't have to do that. You can pay your zakat as long as they're following the 8 categories of people that are worthy of zakat. You can pay your zakat to your own relatives. In fact, your relatives have more right to your zakat than other people. Yeah, if they have need. I mean, you can't just give. No, there has to be real need there. Because that's a hila. That's like a way of trying to abuse the Sharia, to give it. Some people, they give it their wife. A'udhu billah. Hurub. So
what about the fatwa that they made in Al-Azhar about riba, that you can, as far as banks concerned, about that it's not riba if you deal with bank or something like this?
That's a modern, it's a modern fatwa. Muhammad Abdu started that whole idea.
But it's not, you don't see that as right.
Mm-hmm.
About money being riba, are we talking about money we use in the stores?
Yeah, the paper money that we have is founded on, it's an interest-based money, right? In other words, it's printed out of, even banks, if you put $1 into a bank, the bank can literally produce $20 out of nothing. It happens every day.
Not the money itself, just the way you use it is really, no?
Yeah, but it represents interest-bearing. The actual foundation of the money is based on interest-bearing bonds. You see, so the money is only issued because it has. Yeah, bartering. Traditional Islamic money is gold, silver, and bartering, traditionally. And the Sharia does not recognize paper money unless it's backed by gold or silver.
Gold and silver, that's like you look at the stock market and exchange and the rate on gold and silver, wouldn't that be productive?
That's because we're living in artificial economies. If gold is your standard, you see, then the gold does not fluctuate a great deal unless there is an introduction of gold into the economy, like a new discovery. For instance, if mines are discovered somewhere and there's a lot of gold introduced into the economy, circulation, then that will cause a temporary fluctuation. But generally, gold and silver maintain their... so what we're seeing in the fluctuations of gold and silver is artificial, because it doesn't represent the true value of gold and silver, which are intrinsic. It's only gauging them by the dollar, which has no intrinsic worth whatsoever. Its worth is based on the trust of the people in the economy, based on the amount of circulation, right? Inflation. I mean, these are all mechanisms that are being gauged by the Federal Reserve Bank and things like that.
So because you're working on a necessity using the dollar, then would it not be counted as riba?
Well, it's not, inshallah, it's not a wrong action because it's a darura, right? That's an example of usr, where the, ammal balwa. But the Muslims are supposed to try to find ways to get out of those type situations if they can.
What about the position that it's okay to invest in stocks because you're taking a risk?
Yeah, my Sheikh Muhammad Ahmed Shaybani, who was one of my teachers, he just didn't give any opinions about stock because he was just bothered by them. I think the problem with stocks is that the vast majority of companies that you're investing in are doing a lot of haram stuff, right? And your money has to be pure. There's Muslims that do a lot of stuff. Just because they're Muslims, that doesn't mean a whole lot to me, personally. Muslim financing houses, Muslim insurance company, Muslim baseball, Muslim football, Muslim liquor stores. There's Muslim liquor store. We've got most of the liquor stores in San Francisco are run by, a lot of them are run by quote unquote Muslims. And you go, don't go into these places, but, on the cash register, they'll have an ayah of Quran, هَذَا مِنْ فَضْلِ رَبِّي or something, Yeah, you see it. A lot, yeah. And it's interesting that they go to a lot of times the areas where there's a lot of minorities and things like that, which they are replacing. It's interesting, but traditionally that was what the Jewish role in this country. Right? In this country, the Jews would often go into ghetto areas and they would open stores and do these things. And this is where a lot of the animosity of the host community towards the Jews came from. It's because they would see them as parasitical. They're living off our community and they're not contributing to the community. And this is exactly how the Muslims are being viewed now in a lot of the minority communities, really, which is really sad because there's just a lot of anger towards the communities. And I think it's justifiable anger, what are you doing going in as a Muslim? What are you doing going in and providing liquor for people who the liquor is literally being used to oppress them? You go into Oakland and every third store is a liquor store. You can get, it's easier for children there to get liquor than it is to get vegetables or milk in a lot. Seriously, it's unbelievable. And Muslims are participating in that. A'udhu billah. Their ancestors brought light to the places they went to. Really, the Yemeni merchants, the Arabian merchants, the Indian merchants, they went around and they brought Islam to people. And these people, they're just, and they're dark. You look at them, they have no light in their faces. They're just dark people, And there was a mosque, I know a place that was built, and it was built, these guys all had liquor stores, selling pornographic magazines and liquor. And then they're at the mosque. Building a mosque on that type of money and arguing about, I saw a guy come into to a halal grocery store to buy halal meat, and somebody told me he had a restaurant. And I knew where the restaurant was, and I wanted to find out if the meat was halal because I thought, there was a place I could take my family or something like that. And I asked him, he said, no, the meat's not halal. And I said, well, why don't you provide meat? And he said, because we only use one part of the meat, and when we use so much, it'd be really hard. We haven't found providers. And then he said, and anyway, you know, I don't think it would change the Muslim business that much because, you know, we sell alcohol. And I'm thinking, you know, what's this guy doing buying halal meat? And this is a type of real, I mean, you're dealing with some very, very psychotic conditions here, right? Because here's somebody so disconnected from reality. Like the source of his income is haram. And he's worried about the meat he's eating, whether it was the biha or not. And it's just very odd. Muslims really strange sometimes.
He has his mother living with him, and she says it has to be halal meat or whatever. So he's doing.
That's a nice way of looking at it.
Musta'man, what are the laws for Musta'man?
Musta'man is they follow the agreements of the conditions that they came into the country. What the host country, they put stipulations on you when you come in. And you tell them, I'm going to abide by your laws. And they've trusted you. And that trust is binding because you're a Muslim. And a Muslim doesn't betray trust, even to a non-Muslim. You know.
If you came as an illegal alien, it's okay.
Alhamdulillah.